The streets of Rome buzzed with the energy of a world empire. Towering columns framed bustling forums where senators debated and merchants hawked their wares. To the casual eye, Rome was the apex of civilization, powerful, cultured, eternal. But behind the marble facades and gold-tipped standards lay a reality rarely discussed, a society meticulously divided by caste and underpinned by the brutal machinery of slavery. In this rigid world, every citizen, every freedman, every enslaved soul had a place carved out for them by birth, fortune, or fate. The Republic's ideals of liberty and virtue were never meant for all. They were privileges guarded by bloodlines and power. As Rome expanded across continents, absorbing peoples and cultures, its internal hierarchies only grew more complex and more ruthless. Today, we step into that hidden Rome, the Rome that lived and breathed through human subjugation. Lucius Aemilius, draped in his fine crimson-bordered toga, was a man born into the privileges of Rome's ruling class, a senator whose ancestry traced back to the earliest days of the Republic. To him, the stratified society of Rome was the natural order of things, as immovable as the gods themselves. His villa, perched on the outskirts of the city, buzzed with the quiet, constant labor of dozens of slaves, cooks, scribes, tutors, and body servants. Lucius' wealth was not merely measured in coin or land, but in the number of human lives he controlled. Beneath Lucius in the social hierarchy stood Marcus Varro, an ambitious equestrian, a member of the wealthy class of knights, though not. Born into the senatorial elite, Marcus had built his fortune through shrewd contracts with the Roman army, supplying grain and arms. He was respected, envied even, but to the eyes of the ancient aristocracy, he was still new money, an upstart. Marcus, however, knew how the game was played. Wealth bought influence, and influence, perhaps one day, could buy nobility. Further down lived Gaius Cato, a plebeian craftsman whose family had eked out a modest existence in the crowded quarters of Rome for generations. His hands were rough from the endless work of leather tanning, a profession that, while necessary, stained both hands and reputation. Gaius harbored no illusions about rising through the ranks. For the plebeians, life was a constant struggle against debt, disease, and disdain. Among the freedmen was Felix, once a slave captured during Rome's conquest of Greece. Clever and adaptable, he had earned his manumission after years of loyal service to a minor magistrate. Now a businessman himself, Felix owned a small tavern where freedmen and lower-class Romans mingled in the shadows of the grand forums. Yet, despite his freedom, society would never truly see him as equal. Freedmen occupied a peculiar space, neither slave nor citizen in full measure, forever marked by their past. And then there were the slaves, the unseen engines of Roman life. Among them was Daphne, a young woman seized during Rome's brutal expansion into the east. Once the daughter of a wealthy merchant in Antioch, she now served as a household maid in Lucius's villa. Her world had shrunk to a series of commands: to clean, to serve, to be invisible. For Daphne, the grandeur of Rome was built from broken lives like her own. In Rome, slavery was not just an economic system, it was a cultural institution, deeply embedded in the collective psyche. Slaves were property, tools that walked and breathed. They could be bought, sold, punished, or freed at the whim of their masters. Yet paradoxically, slaves were also the tutors of Rome's elite children, the secretaries who managed vast estates, and the artists who decorated the temples of the gods. Each character moved through this world carrying invisible chains, some heavier than others, but chains nonetheless. In a society obsessed with status and lineage, even a small misstep could lead to social ruin. Every interaction, every choice was filtered through the rigid expectations of caste. At the heart of Roman life was the uneasy tension between the seen and unseen, the free and the enslaved, the powerful and the powerless. And on this particular day, as the city stirred under the rising sun, each of them, Lucius, Marcus, Gaius, Felix, and Daphne, would find their lives woven together by events none could yet foresee. The first light of dawn crept over the rooftops of Rome, casting long golden shadows across the bustling city. In the villa of Lucius Aemilius, the day began not with leisure, but with ritual. Before the household fully stirred, Lucius rose from his bed, attended by 2 silent slaves who brought him a basin of cool water. Cleanliness was not merely a matter of comfort, it was a reflection of discipline and Roman virtue. Lucius' first act of the day was a solemn prayer at the Lararium, a small household shrine dedicated to the Lares and Penates, the guardian spirits of the family and home. Incense curled upwards as he muttered invocations, seeking protection and favor. Religion was interwoven into every facet of Roman life, not as an act of passion, but as a duty, a contract with the gods. Neglect it, and disaster would surely follow. Meanwhile, Daphne had already been awake for hours. In the slave quarters, little more than damp, dark rooms, she and the other servants had risen before the rooster's crow. Their tasks were many and merciless, preparing bread from coarse flour, fetching water from the public fountains, cleaning the villa's vast marble floors until they gleamed. There was no time for worship among the enslaved. Their prayers, if whispered at all, were stolen moments of private desperation. Across the city, Marcus Varro conducted his own morning routine. As an equestrian, he occupied a space of uneasy mobility. He breakfasted lightly on bread dipped in wine, reading scrolls delivered by messengers, reports on shipments, rumors from the Senate, market trends. For Marcus, information was power. His home, though not as grand as Lucius's villa, was adorned with symbols of status: bronze statues, imported silks, mosaics depicting battles and victories. Every object was a testament to his ambition. In the narrow alleys of the Subura district, Gaius Cato readied himself for another day of labor. His home, a cramped insula, a Roman apartment block, was a far cry from the luxury of the elites. The morning meal was a meager affair: a handful of olives, some cheese, a crust of stale bread. His wife, Marcia, carefully braided their daughter's hair, while Gaius adjusted the simple tunic that marked him as a working man. The family exchanged brief words, knowing the day's demands would scatter them across the city until nightfall. Felix, the freedman, opened the heavy wooden shutters of his tavern. The scents of sour wine and last night's sweat still clung to the air. Freedmen like Felix lived precariously, always balancing their tenuous respectability with the ever-looming stigma of their past. The law allowed him to trade, to own property, even to vote in certain elections, but social acceptance was another matter. In the rigid minds of Rome's old families, a freedman was forever tainted by the brand of slavery. As the sun climbed higher, the city stirred into full life. Merchants shouted their wares in crowded marketplaces: olive oil from Hispania, dates from Africa, perfumes from Arabia. Senators were carried through the streets in litters, avoiding the filth and noise below. In the baths, men of all classes, except of course slaves, would later gather to bathe, socialize, and conduct business. Customs dictated every interaction. A patron like Lucius might offer protection and favors to his many clients, poorer men who sought his influence, in return for loyalty and votes. In the public sphere, power was displayed with elaborate humility. Private ambitions were cloaked beneath the toga of tradition. Daphne, cleaning the triclinium, the formal dining room, caught snippets of her master's conversations. Names of distant provinces floated through the air: Britannia, Judea, Africa. Places she would never see, though the iron hand of Rome stretched to their shores. For the enslaved, geography was a cruel joke. Only chains and death traveled freely. By midday, the city baked under a merciless sun. Vendors shouted louder, donkeys brayed, and the smells of roasted meat, sweat, and sewage thickened the air. Rome was alive, ferocious, indifferent. Yet beneath this chaotic vibrancy, the invisible gears of caste and slavery turned ceaselessly, grinding down lives while lifting others toward fleeting glory. Lucius prepared for a gathering at the Senate House. Marcus finalized a risky investment. Gaius toiled in his workshop. Felix schemed for a better contract. And Daphne, whose dreams were as vivid as any citizen's, silently wiped the dust from her master's statues, erasing even the memory of her own. Little did they know today would not end like any other. The Senate House stood on the Palatine Hill, an imposing structure where Rome's future was forged with every heated debate and every whispered bargain. Today, however, The event that would ripple through Roman society began not in the marble halls of the Senate, but in the chaotic marketplace far from the polished corridors of power. It started with a single man, a gladiator, who found himself at the heart of an event that would leave the city trembling. In the forum, where the bustling crowds gathered daily, a spectacle was about to unfold, one that would expose the raw underbelly of Rome's caste system and bring the invisible suffering of the enslaved to the forefront of public consciousness. Gaius Cato, his hands stained with the oils of leather, was among the crowd. As a craftsman, he had heard rumors of a great public event, the Games of the Consuls. Every year, gladiators fought for honor, for glory, and often for their very lives. But this year was different. A gladiator named Spartacus, a man of extraordinary strength and skill, had been rumored to have defied the expectations of his masters. The stories of his unmatched prowess had spread through the city like wildfire. Felix, sitting in the tavern he had established, overheard gossip about the gladiators' challenge. There were whispers of rebellion, of a gladiator's demand for freedom, of a rising threat. For Felix, such talk stirred old memories of his own chains, memories he had worked so hard to bury. As a freedman, he was part of the system that subjugated others, yet in his heart, he had never fully escaped its shadows. At the Senate, Lucius Aemilius, still fresh from his morning prayers, was preparing to meet with the other elites. The senators were discussing the empire's expansion, its hold over distant territories like Gaul and Egypt. However, the conversation was soon interrupted by the news of a gladiatorial rebellion, a slave uprising led by Spartacus himself. The Wheel. Rebellion had begun in the gladiator training schools, known as the Ludi. Spartacus, once a Thracian soldier, had been forced into the life of a gladiator after being captured in battle. But now, driven by the injustice of his existence, he had sparked a revolt that quickly grew in size. It began with just a handful of men, but word of Spartacus's defiance spread rapidly. Now, thousands of enslaved people and gladiators were rising up, weapons in hand, against their oppressors. It was no longer just a challenge. It was an open declaration of war. Lucius knew that if the rebellion spread, it would undermine everything Rome stood for. The hierarchy of the caste system, the very foundation of Roman society, would be at risk. The senators, though nervous, insisted that the rebellion be quashed immediately. No mercy for slaves, no tolerance for disobedience. For Lucius, it was a personal matter. He had investments in the gladiatorial games which brought profit and prestige to his name. The idea of losing control over these spectacles, these reminders of Rome's power, was unthinkable. Meanwhile, Daphne, unaware of the uprising's scale, went about her duties in the villa. She had heard rumors of gladiators escaping the training schools, but the true scope of the rebellion had not yet reached her. However, the very air seemed to thicken with the tension of impending conflict. The slaves in the villa exchanged uneasy glances, wondering if the revolt would touch them as well. Gaius, ever the realist, knew that Rome's response would be swift and brutal. The Senate would not tolerate such insubordination. He thought of his family back in the crowded insula, of his wife and child. If the rebellion spread, it could mean a violent crackdown across the city. The lower classes, already living in fear of the elite, would be swept up in the chaos, punished for the actions of a few. For Felix, the gladiatorial uprising was a moment of reckoning. He had always looked upon the gladiators as both victims and symbols of the empire's might. Now, however, they had become something more, agents of change, of rebellion. He couldn't help but feel a stirring of hope. Was it possible that the system of power that kept him and his tavern struggling could be toppled? The day wore on, and the news of the revolt continued to spread. The Senate began to call for reinforcements. Armies were mobilized to quell the uprising before it could spiral further out of control. Lucius, his heart heavy with the thought of losing control, joined the ranks of those who would fight to preserve the old order. In the gladiator barracks, Spartacus gathered his followers. With each word he spoke, the flames of rebellion spread. They were no longer just fighting for their lives in the arena. They were fighting for their dignity, their freedom, and their future. The rebellion, which began as a small act of defiance, had now become the most serious challenge Rome had faced in centuries. As the news of Spartacus's rebellion spread across Rome, the reactions were as varied as the city itself. In the Senate, panic swept through the marble halls. Senators, who prided themselves on the stability and grandeur of the Roman Empire, now found themselves facing a crisis that threatened the very foundation of their power. To them, the uprising was more than just a rebellion of slaves. It was an affront to Rome's ideals, its honor, and its unspoken agreement that the empire could do as it pleased without challenge. Lucius Aemilius, once so confident in his status, now found himself questioning his place in this shifting world. The Senate convened quickly, their debates sharp and frantic. Some senators called for an immediate and overwhelming response, sending legions to crush the rebels with fire and blood. Others, though fewer in number, began to voice concerns about the longer-term consequences of such brutal suppression. Were the slaves' grievances so easily dismissed? Would this rebellion be crushed only to leave simmering resentment beneath the surface? But Lucius, ever the conservative, joined the ranks of those who demanded swift retribution. His investments in gladiatorial games and the wealth tied to Rome's slave economy were too important to risk losing. The idea that slaves could challenge their masters in such a direct and violent manner was anathema to everything he had known. He remembered his own slaves, Daphne among them, and the careful balance of power he maintained over them. A revolt like this, he believed, threatened the very structure of Roman society. Meanwhile, in the tavern where Felix worked, the news of Spartacus's challenge reached the ears of the freedmen. At first, many were skeptical. Freedmen, despite their relative autonomy, were still very much part of the lower strata of Roman society. They had worked hard to escape the chains of slavery, but many still lived under the threat of falling back into servitude. For them, the idea of a large-scale slave rebellion was both alluring and terrifying. Felix overheard a conversation between two of his regular customers, men who had once been slaves themselves. One, a burly former gladiator, spoke of Spartacus with a kind of reverence. "He's a god among men," the gladiator said. "He fights not just for survival, but for the freedom of us all." Felix listened intently, his thoughts torn. On the one hand, he could feel the pull of Spartacus's defiance. It mirrored his own desire for freedom, his own struggle against a system that had always kept him just outside the true power of Rome. But on the other hand, he knew that any rebellion, no matter how just, would be crushed under the weight of Rome's military might. The Senate would not tolerate such insubordination. The slaves, despite their courage, would never stand a chance against the legions. Gaius Cato, working in his cramped workshop, heard the news and immediately sensed the danger. He thought of his wife, his young daughter, and the other families in the insula. If the rebellion spread beyond the gladiators, if it reached the heart of the plebeian classes, the consequences would be dire. A violent crackdown, he knew, would come swiftly, and it would affect everyone, not just the enslaved. The plebeians were often caught in the crossfire of Roman politics, exploited for their labor, but never granted the privileges of the elite. Yet, Gaius also understood the resentment simmering just beneath the surface of Roman society. The plebeians, the freedmen and even the slaves, had all suffered under the weight of the upper class for centuries. Spartacus' revolt, though terrifying, was also a symbol of their collective anger. If the revolt succeeded, it could change everything. But that was a dangerous thought, one Gaius dared not voice aloud. At the villa of Lucius Aemilius, the response was more immediate. Lucius ordered his household to prepare for a potential attack. The city guards had already been called to reinforce. The walls and slaves were ordered to double their vigilance. Daphne, along with the other servants, could sense the growing tension. They had heard whispers of the rebellion, of the gladiators' revolt, but the true scope of the threat had not fully reached their ears. As the day wore on, whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into near certainty. The rebellion was no longer contained to the gladiatorial schools. Spartacus and his followers had broken out of their confines and were marching toward the heart of Italy. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they were not stopping. For Daphne, the news stirred a complicated mix of emotions. Fear mingled with something darker, something deeper. The idea of a slave rising up against their masters was a terrifying one, but it was also a long-forgotten dream, a dream of freedom, of escape from the crushing weight of their roles. She glanced at the other slaves, their eyes shadowed with the same quiet desperation. Would the rebellion reach them? Would they too be called to rise to fight for a freedom they had never known? As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue across the city, the stark contrast between the ruling class and the enslaved was more evident than ever. In the Senate, power players made their final preparations. In the taverns, freedmen and former slaves debated their fates. And in the shadowy corridors of Roman villas, slaves whispered of their own, quiet hopes for a future they were told they could never have. The revolt of Spartacus was not just a threat to the Roman elite. It was a crack in the foundation of a system that had defined the ancient world for centuries. And though the consequences of this moment would take time to unfold, one thing was certain: Rome would never be the same again. As the rebellion of Spartacus gained momentum, the very nature of Rome began to shift. The city, once a symbol of unchallenged power and order, now trembled beneath the threat of an uprising that could dismantle the intricate social fabric on which it had been built. The legions of Rome, initially slow to react, were mobilized with unprecedented urgency. And the Senate, in panic, ordered that all available troops be sent to deal with the growing threat. Lucius Aemilius, observing the turmoil from his villa, realized that this rebellion could very well threaten everything he held dear. His wealth, his position, even his reputation among the elite of Rome, all were at risk. To lose control over his slaves, to see the revolt spread, would be a humiliation that no Roman noble could endure. But as news of the growing rebellion reached the Senate, Lucius was called upon to take a more active role in combating the insurgents. He found himself thrust into the political maelstrom, attempting to navigate a dangerous game of power, fear, and political survival. In the darkened streets of the city, Gaius Cato moved cautiously. The tension was palpable. The slaves in the insula were increasingly agitated, and word of the rebellion had begun to spread to the lower classes. Though many of the plebeians feared retribution, others whispered of the promise of freedom, of a world in which the lowborn might stand alongside the elite. But there were more whispers too, and these carried a more sinister tone. Some feared that Spartacus's success might inspire more uprisings across the empire. The mob in the streets, already volatile, could turn on anyone, even the plebeians. In the chaos that followed, Felix, ever the pragmatist, watched from the shadows. He saw an opportunity, but also an overwhelming risk. Freedmen, like him, were always caught between two worlds, that of the free citizen and that of the subjugated. In times of unrest, this precarious position became even more dangerous. As much as he sympathized with the slaves and gladiators rising against their masters, he knew that the power of Rome could crush them in an instant. He had seen it before in the crushing of revolts from conquered provinces. The brutality of Rome's legions was legendary, yet Felix could not entirely quell the spark of hope that Spartacus's rebellion ignited within him. What if the old order could be toppled? What if the hierarchical structure of Rome could be dismantled, freeing not just the slaves but also the oppressed of every caste? It was a dream too dangerous to speak aloud, but it lingered, haunting him. In the heart of the rebellion, Spartacus himself stood at a crossroads. He had become more than just a gladiator. He was now a symbol, the leader of thousands of enslaved people and disenfranchised souls, all of them united under the banner of freedom. Spartacus's forces, though initially poorly organized, had grown in strength and discipline, pushing through Rome's territories with increasing boldness. His aim was clear, not just to escape, but to overthrow the system of oppression that bound him and his people. But Spartacus faced a moral dilemma. As his army advanced, the cost of rebellion became evident. Every battle won meant more Roman lives lost, and every slave who joined the cause left behind a life of servitude for one of constant danger. Spartacus was no fool. He understood that a successful revolt would require not just courage, but the ability to maintain discipline and vision. The people who followed him were not all warriors. Many were former farmers, artisans, or even the children of slaves. They did not have the training, the weapons, or the organization to face Rome's legions head-on. Yet as he looked out over his growing army, Spartacus saw something else: hope. For many, the rebellion was not just a chance for freedom, it was a chance for dignity, for the chance to reclaim their humanity. The question that hung over his every decision was whether he could keep his followers unified, or whether the promise of freedom would splinter under the weight of Rome's might. At the same time, Lucius Aemilius, despite his cold calculations, began to feel the first seeds of doubt. In the Senate, a divided leadership was beginning to question whether the crushing force they had planned to unleash would cause more damage than it was worth. Though the senators spoke of Roman might, they were now acutely aware of the cracks forming within their own society. The rebellion was more than a military threat. It was a symbolic act of resistance, one that questioned the very legitimacy of the Roman way of life. Could they justify the massacre of so many, especially when the forces they were fighting against were not just slaves, but people who had once been Romans themselves? A key moment came when the Senate appointed Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, to take control of the legions and suppress the rebellion. Crassus was known for his brutal efficiency and his iron-fisted rule. Under his command, the legions began to tighten the noose around Spartacus's growing army, pushing them further south. The legion's presence loomed over Rome like a storm cloud, ready to unleash its fury. For Spartacus and his army, the end seemed inevitable, but the question remained: would they be crushed before they could achieve their freedom? Would the price of their rebellion, the loss of countless lives, be worth the dream of breaking free from Rome's iron grip? Lucius Aemilius, watching Sao, the increasing tensions in the Senate, realized that even the elites, those most insulated from the violence of the streets, were beginning to fear the consequences. In their quest to preserve the old order, they had already started to lose control of the very system they had once wielded so effectively. Rome had become a tinderbox with a single spark, a rebellion, a misstep, threatening to set everything aflame. As the Roman legions closed in on Spartacus and his followers, the world that had once seemed unshakable began to crumble. The rebellion, which had started as an act of defiance by a few, had become a movement that shook the foundations of Rome itself. But despite their courage and determination, the rebels were ultimately crushed in a final bloody clash. Spartacus, along with thousands of his followers, died in battle, and the Senate declared that the revolt had been put to rest. For Lucius Aemilius, the end of the rebellion brought a sense of grim relief, yet it was tempered by a growing unease. The echoes of Spartacus's challenge lingered in the streets of Rome, a reminder that the power structures that had once seemed eternal were fragile. The brutality with which the rebellion was suppressed left scars on both the empire and the hearts of its people. Rome's victory was clear, but it came at a high cost, and it served as a painful reminder that even the most powerful empire is not invincible. The rebellion had sparked a debate that would echo throughout history. What does freedom truly mean, and at what cost is it worth pursuing? For many of the enslaved, for Felix, Gaius, and even Daphne, the dream of liberty seemed further out of reach than ever before. But the fire of revolt had been kindled, and though it was snuffed out, the embers would continue to burn in the hearts of the oppressed.